Story 1. Doctors use live experiments for data. Let me tell you this story the way it needs to be told. Not as a history lesson, not as a list of crimes, but as a warning about what happens when intelligence is allowed to operate without limits. If you saw Josef Mengele walking down the street, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, highly educated. He didn't look dangerous. And that's exactly what made him dangerous. Mengele was a physician, a scientist, and most importantly, a man who believed deeply in his own ideas. He believed that human beings could be classified, measured, and improved. That science wasn't just about healing, it was about deciding who mattered. When he arrived at Auschwitz in 1943, the world gave him something he had been waiting for. A place with no boundaries. On the railway platform, as transports arrived, Mengele would stand calmly among the chaos. He didn't shout orders. He didn't rush. He observed. With a small movement of his hand, people were directed one way or another. Some were sent to work. Others were sent somewhere they would never return from. To Mengele, this wasn't cruelty. It was sorting. Witnesses later said the most disturbing thing wasn't the decisions themselves. It was how routine they felt, how ordinary he made them seem. Mengele was fascinated by genetics, especially twins. To him, twins weren't siblings with lives and histories. They were opportunities, controlled comparisons, living data. He separated them from their families without hesitation, not because he hated them, but because they were useful. He kept meticulous notes, asked questions, compared outcomes. Everything was done with precision. There was no loss of control, no emotional outbursts, only focus. What makes this story truly unsettling isn't just what Mengele did, it's how he thought about it. He believed he was contributing to the future, that his work would one day be understood, that morality was something temporary but science was permanent. In his mind, empathy slowed progress, and anyone who questioned him simply lacked the intelligence to see the bigger picture. When the war ended, many expected justice to finally arrive. But Mengele disappeared. Not in panic, not in shame. He went into hiding quietly, first in Europe, then escaping to South America under false names: Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil. For decades, he lived a life that looked almost ordinary. Friends, routines, conversations, days that passed without consequence. Intelligence agencies searched for him. At times, they came close. But Josef Mengele was never captured. And that's what makes the ending of this story so disturbing. He didn't die in a courtroom. He didn't answer questions. He didn't have to explain himself. In 1979, he suffered a fatal stroke while swimming at a beach in Brazil. He was buried under a name that wasn't his own. It took years for the truth to catch up. And here's the part that stays with you. There's no evidence that Josef Mengele ever believed he was wrong. Not once. He didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as logical, as necessary. Some people commit terrible acts because they lose control, others because they're driven by fear or hatred. Mengele didn't fit any of those categories. He acted calmly, deliberately, with purpose. And that leaves us with a question that's uncomfortable to sit with. If intelligence is separated from ethics, if knowledge is given authority without accountability, how far can a human being go before humanity itself disappears? Because Josef Mengele didn't think he was doing evil. He thought he was doing science. Story 2. Deadly Experiments, in Unit 731. Let me tell you this story slowly, because the most disturbing part of Shiro Ishii's story isn't just what happened during the war, it's what happened after. Shiro Ishii wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a rogue scientist. He was a military doctor, a general, a respected figure in Imperial Japan, and he believed that war was more than conflict. To him, war was opportunity. In Harbin, China, a research complex was built. On the surface, it looked like a standard military facility. In reality, it operated under a different set of rules. This was Unit 731. Under Ishii's leadership, everything was organized, systematic, controlled. There were protocols, reports, results. The people inside the system weren't referred to as individuals. They were treated as materials interchangeable and expendable. What makes this story unsettling isn't chaos. It's order. The experiments weren't driven by rage. They were driven by curiosity. Ishii believed that understanding how the human body failed under extreme conditions was essential to modern warfare. He wasn't interested in healing. He was interested in efficiency. Biological weapons weren't developed as a last resort. They were engineered as strategic tools. Diseases were studied not for treatment, but for how effectively they spread and destroyed. And in Ishii's mind, none of this was cruelty. It was contribution. He believed he was serving his country, advancing science, preparing for future wars. Empathy, to him, was irrelevant. As the war drew to a close, many expected accountability. But Ishii had already planned ahead. He disappeared, faked his death, erased his trail, and then he did something few war criminals ever managed to do. He negotiated. Ishii understood the value of what he possessed, data that other nations couldn't ethically obtain on their own. In exchange for full access to his research, he was granted immunity. No trial, no public reckoning. Justice was quietly set aside. Shiro Ishii returned to Japan and lived the rest of his life in relative peace. He died in 1959 from cancer, never having faced a courtroom. And that's the part that stays with you. Because this story isn't just about wartime atrocities. It's about compromise. About what happens when justice is weighed against strategic advantage and loses. Shiro Ishii didn't escape by running forever. He escaped because his work was considered useful. And that leaves us with a question that's hard to ignore. When knowledge becomes valuable enough, what crimes are people willing to forgive? Story 3. Mysterious Deaths in House Number 12. Let me tell you this story carefully. Because Marcel Petiot didn't hunt people the way you might expect. He didn't chase them. They came to him. During World War II, Paris was a city filled with fear. People were disappearing, arrested, executed, vanishing overnight. And in moments like that, desperation changes how people think. Marcel Petiot was a doctor, well-spoken, educated, convincing. He understood something crucial. When people are desperate, they don't need proof. They need hope. Petiot created what he called an escape network. He used the name Dr. Eugene and claimed he could smuggle people out of occupied France and into South America. For a price, a very high one. But to someone facing arrest, that price felt reasonable. People arrived at his house on Rue Le Sueur carrying suitcases, documents, everything they owned. They believed they were about to be saved. Petiot welcomed them calmly, explained the process, told them they needed a vaccine before traveling, a simple precaution. It sounded official, medical, safe. They trusted him, and that trust is what killed them. For a long time, no one noticed. Disappearances were common during the war. But on the 11th of March 1944, neighbors noticed something strange. A smell. Thick, dark smoke coming from Petiot's chimney. Police entered the house, and everything unraveled. What they found made it clear this wasn't an accident. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. Petiot fled, changed names, changed identities. At one point, he even joined the French resistance under a false name, actively participating in the search for the very man responsible. Eventually, he was caught in October 1944. At his trial in 1946, Petiot admitted to killing dozens of people, but he claimed they were enemies, traitors, collaborators. The court didn't accept that. He was convicted of murder for profit. On the 25th of May, 1946, Marcel Petiot was executed by guillotine in Paris. Witnesses said he was calm, unbothered, even joking moments before his death. And that's what makes this story so disturbing, because Petiot didn't rely on violence alone. He relied on trust. He used medicine, authority, and desperation as weapons. And it leaves behind a final, uncomfortable thought. In times of chaos, the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who threaten you. Sometimes, they're the ones who promise to save you. We've just heard three very different stories. Three people, three justifications. One believed science was above morality. One believed war erased all limits. And one used trust as the perfect disguise. So here's the question I want to ask you. What do you find more disturbing? Someone who commits evil out of rage, or someone who is calm, calculated, and convinced they're doing the right thing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If stories like this make you pause and think, hit like so I know, and subscribe. Not for entertainment, but so we can keep exploring the darker corners of human behavior.